Now that you have a broad understanding of the digestive system, we'll work through the components individually, beginning with those of the upper gastrointestinal tract. And I do have a brief announcement. The last 16 hours have been pretty busy. By the time I ended my last recording yesterday and sat down to record today, there was another child born. So this is Lyndon, and here my son Everett's holding him. I finished recording my lecture around 2:30 yesterday. We went to the hospital at 3:30, our birthing center, delivered, and then we were home at 9 p.m. last night, and here I am this morning. So things are going well. So we're on to worksheet 9.2. All right, food meme, tangentially related to stomach and digestion, we'll be working through shortly. And then we got another stomach one, going back to the library after lunch, and I believe this is from the movie The Babadook, and your stomach screaming whale sounds. And then finally another baby-related one. This was Everett, just the picture he drew and sent to us while we were over at the birth center here of us coming home. Thought that was pretty funny in his creepy little expression there. We'll begin by differentiating between mechanical and chemical digestion, and then we'll move through the general components of the upper GI tract. The upper GI tract is where digestion begins. And there are two types of digestion we can talk about. There's mechanical digestion and there's chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion, shown here, is the breaking down of that ingested material just into smaller pieces. Whereas chemical digestion will take those smaller pieces and continue to break them down using enzymes, right? We break down that food into the chemical building blocks, like, for example, breaking down starches to simple sugars. Quick question right off the bat. Where does digestion begin within the GI tract? I think I might have mentioned it in the previous lecture. It's true, it begins in the mouth. So let's now turn to the oral cavity. Mechanical digestion, specifically mastication, begins within the oral cavity, the entrance to the digestive tract. So we see that mastication helps break down the food into smaller pieces that allow us to swallow it, and it also, by breaking into smaller pieces, increases the surface area of that ingested material to the enzymes that are needed to help break it down. Now, your teeth, for example, they're what allow us to chew, and they're covered with enamel. And enamel is the hardest structure found in your body. So it allows us to properly chew things and break up really hard substances to expose them to those enzymes. I should mention here that no absorption of nutrients occurs within the oral cavity. In response to food entering the oral cavity, saliva is going to be secreted from the salivary glands. That saliva is going to be mixed with the ingested materials to form a bolus. So saliva plus ingested food equals a bolus. So we see then that chemical digestion also begins in the mouth, not only the mechanical digestion via chewing. So one of the enzymes you may have heard of is amylase, and salivary amylase is a component of your saliva, and it helps break down starches into their simpler building blocks. So we can break down starch into maltose, for example, which is a disaccharide. The bolus that was formed within the mouth is going to be moved to the pharynx or throat during swallowing. And there's going to be mucus secreted from the upper part of the pharynx, as well as some mucus within your saliva that's going to act as lubricant for that swallow reflex. And we'll look at that swallow reflex more in depth shortly. The bolus will then move from the pharynx through the esophagus and into the stomach. Mucus is going to be secreted within the esophagus along the way that again is going to act as a lubricant for the passage of that bolus. That bolus is going to enter the stomach via the esophageal sphincter. Upon entering the stomach, it's going to continue to be churned and mixed with gastric juices. There's going to be secretions from epithelial cells, like hydrochloric acid, enzymes, and they're going to mix together with that bolus. There's going to be contractions of the stomach due to that musculature. It's going to mix everything together into this acidic mixture that we then call chyme. So the bolus becomes chyme in the stomach before passing into the duodenum, which is considered part of the upper GI tract, and that's what we'll leave off today. Now we're going to look specifically at the types and location of the salivary glands, and then we'll talk about simple and conditioned reflexes that can increase saliva. The salivary glands produce, you guessed it, saliva. And there are two types of salivary glands. There are those found within the oral cavity, and we call these intrinsic salivary glands, and there are those found outside of the oral cavity that we call extrinsic salivary glands. So let's talk about these intrinsic salivary glands first that are found within the oral cavity. These are unicellular glands, so one cell, and they can be found on the tongue and the upper portion of the pharynx. And they continuously release secretions independent of whether there's food present in the mouth or not. Now, within the saliva, one of the things they secrete is an enzyme called lingual lipase. Okay, lingual meaning, well, tongue, lipase, we know that's going to break down a fat. And specifically here, we're going to break down triglycerides, or at least begin the digestion of triglycerides. And I should also point out here that compared to the extrinsic salivary glands, we're only talking about a small amount of saliva that's produced by these intrinsic salivary glands, or these unicellular glands. Next, we have the extrinsic salivary glands. So these are those that are found outside of the oral cavity now, and they produce the majority of the saliva. They are the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual glands. We'll begin with the parotid gland. It's the largest of the salivary glands, and we can see it's located anterior and a little bit inferior to the ear. Next, we have the submandibular, so below the mandible, located in that position, and then the sublingual, below the tongue. Okay. And you likely are familiar with at least two of these without even knowing why. So the first of those is going to be the submandibular. The submandibular salivary glands are what we use to gleek, right? So that's where you run your tongue across the roof of your mouth, and you get the salivary ejection from the submandibular salivary gland. So under here next to the frenulum, if you lift your tongue up, we have those submandibular salivary ducts. So that's how you can gleek. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. Big thing when I was in middle school. And you may also be unknowingly familiar with the parotid salivary gland due to its association with mumps. Mumps specifically affects the parotid gland. Okay? So the mumps virus is spread through infected saliva. And when you're infected, you get these swellings of your parotid glands. And likely the majority of you got your MMR vaccines, your measles, mumps, rubella, to prevent this. If you had to guess, out of the three extrinsic salivary glands, which do you think produces the most saliva? Actually, I think I would have gotten this one wrong. It's actually your submandibular, right? So the one that allows you to gleek. That is about 70% of your saliva production, compared to 25% with your parotid. That one seems more intuitive. It's the largest salivary gland, and then only 5% coming from those sublingual salivary glands. On average, we make about 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva that's secreted daily. The majority of that is produced during mealtime, but we have smaller amounts that are continuously produced that make sure that our mouth doesn't dry out, that those mucous membranes remain moist. So if you think about this, this is pretty staggering. That's like a liter bottle of cola of saliva that's being produced per day. The saliva is going to mix with food when we start that mechanical process of digestion within the mouth. So saliva and the ingested materials are going to mix and form that bolus. And actually, in order to stimulate the taste buds, that food needs to be in a solution. It needs to be mixed with saliva. Saliva is 99.5% water and then 0.5% electrolytes and proteins. Saliva is formed as water and electrolytes are filtered from the plasma within capillaries, and then they move through the salivary gland where other components are added, like amylase, mucus, and lysosome. So here's three we're going to touch on. The first is the lysosome. Lysosome, I hold an image here, destroys bacteria, right? They're going to lyse bacteria. We have mucus, that's glycoprotein that helps lubricate the passage of food, and we talked about a couple instances where that occurs. And then we have amylase, which we said catalyzes the hydrolysis reaction, so that's splitting up the starch, that long carbohydrate chain, using a water molecule, and that gives us smaller disaccharide maltose. Here's some cool information that Clark pulled together. I want you to think about how might amylase production vary in response to diet. So we may see that in certain organisms we see a lot of amylase production. In others, that production of amylase might be low. So let's first consider cats. You got to think about the type of diet. Is that a high or a low carbohydrate diet? Well, cats, they completely lack amylase. They have an incredibly protein-rich diet, and it's carbohydrate. So they don't need to be breaking down starches or carbohydrates to extract nutrients, because in general, they're not ingesting them. What if we think about humans now and talk about hunter-gatherer communities? If we look at traditional hunter-gatherer communities and that population, we see they have 3 to 8 copies of the amylase gene, so allowing to produce amylase to break down those carbohydrates, the starches. If we compare that to farmers, those farming communities, the population there, about 7 to 14 copies, so double the number of amylase genes, so higher amylase production then. And this makes sense. Those farming communities, they're going to be planting and harvesting grains predominantly. Things like rice, oats, barley, and wheat. And in order to extract those nutrients from that grain-rich diet, we need to have higher production of amylase. We said that salivary secretion is continuous to prevent the mouth from drying out, but we can reflexively increase salivation. And this can occur via 2 reflexes, a simple reflex or a conditioned reflex. The simple reflex occurs when we activate chemoreceptors or pressure receptors within the mouth, right? So just the presence of food there will pick up on the chemical content or the pressure of food in the mouth, and that is going to send nerve impulses via the afferent nerve to the salivary center within the medulla, that part of the brainstem. Okay, then we're going to see that the salivary center, via autonomic nerves, is going to send signals to the salivary glands to increase salivary secretion. And we term this the simple reflex. Now, just by activating those pressure receptors in the mouth, we can increase salivation. You've probably heard of the old tale, suck on a penny if you're really thirsty. Well, that's because that penny there is going to activate those baroreceptors or pressure receptors, and that's going to promote salivary secretion. So while it's not going to help your thirst, it is going to seem like you're less thirsty perhaps because you're going to have more saliva flowing within your mouth. With the conditioned salivary reflex, on the other hand, we're going to see that salivation can increase without oral stimulation. So we won't be activating those pressure receptors or chemoreceptors in the mouth. In fact, just thinking about food, seeing food, or smelling food as it's being made is enough to increase salivation. So this reflex, though, is a learned response. That means it's based on previous experience. So you have to have some previous knowledge of how food looks, sees, or tastes. The cerebral cortex, then, if you're thinking about or seeing this food or smelling it, is going to stimulate that salivary center within the medulla. And then that is going to send signals via that conditioned reflex to the automatic nerves, salivary glands, to increase salivation. Now, I should note here that both the parasympathetic and sympathetic responses are going to induce saliva flow. If we have a parasympathetic response, right, rest and digest, we're going to have an abundant flow of a more or a less viscous type of saliva. Now, if we have a sympathetic response, fight or flight, we're still going to get saliva, an increase in salivary secretion, but it's going to be a different composition. It's going to be this really thick saliva, which leads us to think we have a dry mouth, like we experience when we're nervous. Anatomy of the pharynx and esophagus will be next. Next, we'll take a little more in-depth look at the pharynx and the esophagus, and these two passageways connect the oral cavity, or the mouth, to the stomach. We're going to look at a little bit more in-depth anatomy here so that we can make sense of the swallow reflex that we'll look at shortly. The pharynx, or the throat, is the passageway that lays behind the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. And it is made up of 3 different regions, beginning with the nasopharynx, followed by the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx. So I can show you here. So this is what those different sections or regions of the pharynx look like, and you can see where they're located then. So we'll start with the most superior, the nasopharynx. And normally, only air passes through the nasopharynx because it's connected to the nasal cavity. And occasionally, you'll get, you've probably experienced if you're sipping a soda or something and then you laugh, you can get fluid to move past this soft palate right here, this flap that prevents things from entering up into the nasal cavity. And then you've probably even seen soda come out of your nose if you laugh hard enough. But typically, this passageway is for air only. The next section of the pharynx is the oropharynx, and this lies directly posterior to the oral cavity, hence oral. And the most inferior section of the pharynx is the laryngopharynx, and this lies directly posterior to the larynx. The pharynx serves as a common passageway for both air and food. We'll see that all 3 sections of the pharynx serve as a common passageway for air as we move through those sections into the trachea. Now, however, only the lower 2 sections of the pharynx are involved with the passage of food as it moves into the esophagus. So the lower 2, common passageway for food, while all 3 serve as the common passageway for air. Now, the other quality of the pharynx is it has these stretchable, distensible walls to accommodate ingested materials. And we'll see that the upper region of the pharynx is lined with ciliated columnar epithelium. That ciliated columnar epithelium helps move mucus around. And while the lower 2 sections, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, those are lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And we've spoken about those before because they help aid in protection against abrasion that would occur with ingested materials that move through that passageway. The esophagus then is what connects the pharynx to the stomach. It's about a 10-inch section of tubing, and that passageway is normally collapsed until you get ingested materials moving through it, and it'll open to accommodate that. And it's directly anterior to the vertebral column, but then posterior to the trachea, that passageway for air. The most inferior section of the esophagus is actually found on the other side of the diaphragm, that muscle that contracts, allowing us to inhale. And so it passes through the diaphragm to connect to the stomach. And in fact, the last about ½ inch of that esophagus is found on the other side of the diaphragm where it connects to the stomach. Now it passes through a little section called the esophageal hiatus. You've probably heard of a hiatus before. It means a pause or a gap in a sequence. So here we have a pause or a gap within the diaphragm, allowing that esophagus to pass through to connect to the stomach. Quick mini case study. A hiatal hernia is a condition in which the upper part of the stomach herniates or bulges through the opening in the diaphragm, so through that esophageal hiatus. Hence, we call this a hiatal hernia. Symptoms are fairly mild. They include heartburn, some chest pain, or maybe some abdominal pain, and some people don't feel anything at all. And we'll finish by looking at the different phases that are involved in a simple swallow. A swallowing is the process of moving ingested materials from the oral cavity or mouth into the stomach. And it actually consists of 3 different phases we'll work through on the next following slides. So it begins with a ball of chewed food or liquid, the bolus, and that's going to be forced by the tongue into the pharynx or the throat. Here, that pressure is going to stimulate the swallowing center within the medulla, that part of the brainstem. That's going to initiate a sequence of muscle contractions, peristalsis. And it's actually the simple act of swallowing is one of the most complex reflexes within the body, and it cannot be stopped once it is initiated. Think about if you eat a chip and it gets stuck in your throat, right? You can't stop swallowing. It just gets forced all the way down, although you wish at times it would stop. Here's an illustration of those peristaltic contractions that act to push a bolus of food toward the stomach. So we can see the first contraction here pushes the bolus into the relaxed section of the esophagus ahead of it. And then the next consecutive contraction is going to occur directly behind it as well. And in this manner, we're going to continue to propel that bolus toward the stomach. Now we'll work through the 3 phases of a swallow. And they include a voluntary phase and involuntary or reflexive phases. So the first phase is voluntary, and therefore it's controlled by the cerebral cortex. Essentially, we can decide when to engage skeletal muscle to use our tongue to push the food against the hard palate, found at the top of the mouth there, the roof of the mouth, and move that bolus towards the oral pharynx. Remember, that's that region of the pharynx directly behind the oral cavity. And then once the food is at the entry to the oral pharynx, we initiate the swallow reflex, and it's no longer a voluntary action. When that bolus is pushed to the entry point of the oral pharynx, there's some mechanoreceptors there. And we'll trigger those mechanoreceptors. They're going to detect that increased pressure. We're going to send action potentials to the swallowing center in the brainstem, the medulla. The medulla is going to initiate a few involuntary responses via motor neurons. The first is that we're going to elevate the soft palate and the uvula, and that's going to block the entry of food into the nasopharynx. The next thing we're going to see is that the epiglottis right here is going to fold over the laryngeal opening. That's going to prevent food from entering the larynx, that air passageway. The epiglottis we'll look at next in a short video. It's this leaf-shaped flap in the throat, and that prevents the food from entering the trachea and the lungs. Now, speaking of, the medulla is also going to inhibit the respiratory center so we don't try and breathe simultaneously. That could lead to choking, and you can give it a shot. It's impossible to swallow and breathe at the same time, thanks to this mechanism. And the last thing we're going to see is that there's an esophageal sphincter, the superior esophageal sphincter, that's going to open, and then pharyngeal muscles are going to push that bolus into the esophagus.
If you've ever had something go down the wrong tube, this structure right here is to blame. Its name is the epiglottis, and it's made of elastic cartilage. Its job is to actually block off the airway, which is what you're looking at here, when you're swallowing food or drink, and then it'll go down the correct tube here, which is called the esophagus. But if it fails to do its job, you can see exactly how the food or drink could go in the wrong tube, but this is going to cause a really strong cough reflex because you do not, by any means, want any digestible material going into your respiratory.
The third and final phase of the swallow is the esophageal phase, and this is also involuntary. So during this time, that bolus is going to move from the pharynx to the esophagus, and the presence of the bolus there is going to stimulate peristaltic contractions within the esophagus. So the contractions move like waves to propel the food into the stomach, and we looked at that action a few slides earlier. The superior esophageal sphincter is now going to close and normal breathing can resume. Now, as this bolus moves through the esophagus, the inferior esophageal sphincter is going to open to allow that bolus to pass into the stomach. And that's the swallow reflex. You probably didn't think a swallow could be so complicated, but there it is.